everybody's wondering today, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope? Probably not. I mean, we have no proof. Not that that stops anyone else when it comes to the news, but
Hello. So good to see you.
But it was a weird coincidence that Pope Francis has tragically passed. He was an elderly man, obviously. He was 88 years old. He'd had recent health scares, but that he passed right after meeting J.D. Vance, right after doing like kind of a public event where he didn't look like any day could be his last. And then he did pass away. It was on Easter Monday. And you never know, symbolically, those things can affect, I think, a person's, I don't know, I don't want to say will to live, but maybe that's not just a coincidence. That's this very significant day. But anyway, it did come a day after he had this meeting with the vice president.
Putin approached Pope Francis with a slight grin on his face, and the two shook hands. Next, the two met privately for about 50 minutes. The discussion focused on the ongoing war in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East. After their private session, the two exchanged gifts. The Russian leader explained the embroidery that he gave to the Pope.
In a recent interview, Pope Francis said that Ukraine should have the courage to, quote, wave the white flag and negotiate. The Pope also said that Ukraine shouldn't be ashamed to negotiate. The waving of a white flag is universally recognized as a symbol of surrender.
Our mover and shaker this morning, Vladimir Putin, he is snubbing President Obama by not attending this week's G8 meeting of world leaders at Camp David. He is the first Russian president to skip the summit since Moscow joined the group. He's angry about U.S. criticism of Russia's recent elections and U.S. plans to build a missile shield in Europe. The two countries have also clashed over the violent crackdown on opposition protesters in Syria and also Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Francis said he hoped the nuclear deal reached with Iran may be a definitive step toward a more secure and fraternal world.
Hassan Rouhani's trip to Vatican City is part of the first state visit by an Iranian president to Europe in 17 years. The meeting showcases a long-standing relationship between the Vatican and Iran.
The Pope isn't just the leader of more than 1 billion Catholics. He's also the head of the Vatican City state. It's the smallest country in the world, but it definitely has political pull. Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, is scheduled to meet with Pope Francis on Wednesday for their second diplomatic meeting. The main discussion points will probably revolve around Russia's role in Ukraine's conflict and also in Syria's brutal civil war. Russia is being highly criticized by the West. As a result, many European countries and the U.S. are giving it the cold shoulder. Now Russia's president will probably try to gain an ally in Pope Francis, especially with his coming visit to the U.S. in September. The relationship between the Holy See and Russia has a complicated past. After years of tension during the Cold War, their ties improved after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev met with John Paul II back in 1989. Years have passed and the relationship has improved. Pope Francis met with Putin back on November 25, 2013 for roughly 35 minutes, this before meeting with the Vatican's diplomatic team. And now, in addition to discussing the role of Russia in Ukraine and Syria, interreligious collaboration will surely be on the list. With the persecution of Christians in the Middle East by the Islamic State, Pope Francis is looking for support from different religious leaders, including the Orthodox. It's estimated that there are roughly 100 million Orthodox in Russia alone.
Additionally, it is likely they will discuss about the possibility in the Pope visiting Russia. This is because now the relations between Rome and the Patriarch of Moscow are more cordial. The meeting is expected to be long. In the past, the discussions have lasted 35 to 50 minutes. If he stays true to his style, Vladimir Putin will be late. He's the only world leader who makes even the Pope wait.
This is the notorious Naval Engineering School in Buenos Aires. Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina's dictatorship turned it into a prison and torture center for dissidents.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
An historic trial that began Tuesday in Argentina is set to reveal new details about how 6 Latin American countries coordinated with each other in the 1970s and 1980s to eliminate political dissidents. The campaign, known as Operation Condor, involved military dictatorships in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. They worked together to track down and kidnap and kill people they labeled as terrorists, leftist activists, labor organizers, students, priests, journalists, guerrilla fighters, and their families. The campaign was launched by Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, and evidence shows the CIA and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger were complicit from its outset. At least 25 military generals are facing charges, and more than 500 witnesses are expected to testify during the trial. Last August, an Argentine federal judge issued a formal request to the Obama administration's Justice Department to make Kissinger himself available for questioning. The Obama administration did not respond.
The trial is taking place in Buenos Aires, the site of a former auto mechanic shop turned torture camp. Argentina is where the greatest number of killings of foreigners was carried out under Operation Condor.
This is the notorious Naval Engineering School in Buenos Aires. Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina's dictatorship turned it into a prison and torture center for dissidents. Among the prisoners were 2 Jesuit priests, Orlando Yorio and Francisco Jalix. Their families asked the then head of Argentina's Jesuits, Jorge Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, to help get them released. Some now allege he turned a blind eye to their plight, or perhaps did worse.
Obviously, it is an episode that isn't clear what was his role during the dictatorship. And as I said, Yorio died convinced that he had been given up by Bergoglio to the repressive regime.
Argentina has reopened a number of human rights cases connected to the dictatorship in recent years, and Bergoglio was called to testify twice as a witness in crimes against humanity cases. The church hierarchy never spoke out against the military regime, and some bishops even supported it.
Operation Condor was born in the 1970s. The Cuban Revolution coincided with a number of independence and anti-colonial movements across the global south. In Latin America, this energy was met with a series of right-wing military coups across the continent for over a decade. In 1964 in Brazil, in 1971 in Bolivia, in Chile and Uruguay in 1973, and in Argentina in 1976. The new regimes were ruthless, subjecting their opposition to measures like targeted arrests, imprisonment, torture, kidnappings, rape, and murder. While Operation Condor was not a U.S. program, declassified documents show it undeniably had the backing of the U.S. The U.S. was equally paranoid about Latin America becoming a base for left-wing uprisings, and the brutality of Operation Condor was a convenient and effective method of containment. The Condor program existed during both the Nixon-Ford and Carter administrations. The Nixon-Ford administration directly financed and armed many of the dictatorships involved. The U.S. also directly trained many officials who went on to create the Condor system at the U.S. Army School of the Americas training camp in Panama, where they were taught counterinsurgency tactics. The U.S. also provided communication support, which was crucial to the operation of the Condor program. There is no question that the U.S. had full knowledge of the scope and brutality of what was taking place. Operation Condor began to collapse in the late 70s after the assassination of Orlando Letelier, Chilean diplomat close to Salvador Allende. U.S. President Jimmy Carter pressured the Chilean regime to curb its repressive tactics, while Chile and Argentina began fighting over control of the Beagle Channel in 1977. The conflict, which nearly led to war, also began to create fractures between other dictatorships. But the end of the Condor program did not spell an end to political repression and violence in the region. The different regimes' agents and police continued to cooperate to kidnap, murder, and torture people for years to come. The Condor program resulted in an estimated 50,000 killed, 30,000 disappeared, and up to 400,000 arrested and imprisoned. Few of those responsible for ordering and carrying out Condor's campaign of terror and brutality have been brought to justice. Many continued to hold high-ranking government and military positions even after regimes ended, while others went into exile abroad to avoid prosecution. Many victims and their remains are still missing. There has also been no real reckoning for those who were involved in backing and financing regimes from abroad. Over the years, some prosecutions have taken place, but they have been few and far between. Perhaps the highest profile arrest was that of former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, who was arrested in London and brought back to Chile. But years of legal wrangling meant that he died still having escaped conviction for any of his crimes. The historic life sentences handed down by an Italian court in 2021 will bring some comfort, but for many, justice for their disappeared friends and loved ones may never come.
Days after the conclave ends, the rule of Pope Francis and the Argentine dictatorship hounds him. Leftist author Horacio Verbitsky says then Father Jorge Bergoglio collaborated with Argentina's dictator Jorge Rafael Videla. Verbitsky extensively wrote about Argentina's dirty war from 1976 to 1983. Verbitsky publishes a photo of Bergoglio giving Holy Communion to Videla. Critics also bring up the case of two Jesuits whom Bergoglio allegedly failed to protect from the dictatorship. Bergoglio denies this claim.
The Latin American country is currently undergoing social and political upheaval since the death of former leader Hugo Chavez. They held a meeting behind closed doors, but during their formal greeting, the atmosphere seemed relaxed. Pope Francis joked and President Maduro was quite talkative. During their 20-minute-long meeting, the two leaders spoke about the situation in Venezuela following the death of Chavez. Topics such as the fight against crime, drug trade, and poverty were discussed. They also talked about the role the Catholic Church and its charitable institutions play in Venezuela. In the past, the relationship between the two states has been tense, but the attitude seemed quite easygoing, and both Maduro and the Pope joked a lot during their conversations. Even when the Pope greeted Maduro's entourage, he didn't lose the opportunity to make a few funny remarks. As a gift, the Pope received an image of the Virgin of Coromoto, who is the patroness of Venezuela, also a lithograph of Simón Bolívar, and a sculpted image of José Gregorio Hernández, a doctor from Caracas, whose beatification process is currently underway. In turn, the Pope gave Maduro a white pen from the Vatican Museum and a copy of the Aparecida Conclusion. At the end of the meeting, Pope Francis blessed the Venezuelan president by tracing a sign of the cross over his forehead.
Days after the conclave ends, the rule of Pope Francis and the Argentine dictatorship hounds him.
With this symbolic military salute, the former superior general of the Jesuits, Adolfo Nicolas, handed the baton to the next leader of the Society of Jesus, the Venezuelan Arturo Sosa. In the meantime, in the General Curia in Rome, there were satisfied looks all around. A spokesperson made the announcement.
This morning, after 4 days of prayer and reflection, the Society of Jesus has elected Father Arturo Sosa from Venezuela as our new Superior General. He is 68 years old, and at the moment, he is the delegate for the International Roman Houses of the Society of Jesus.
One of the electors was Father Federico Lombardi, former spokesman for the Pope and a good friend of the new general. He said that Father Arturo Sosa is a reflection of the moment the Jesuits are living.
Pope Francis is acting like a boss. Vatican is set to take over the Knights of Malta after the British head of the Catholic Church's oldest and largest chivalric order resigned after Pope Francis was rubbed the wrong way in a row over some rubbers. The feud between the Knights and the papacy began when Grand Master Matthew Festic dismissed the order's foreign minister for allowing the distribution of condoms in Myanmar. Pope Francis then got involved, which caused Festic to push back. The Pope opera came to a head when Francis asked Festing to resign. The Vatican then announced the order would be taken over by a papal delegate. The struggle reflects the growing tension between the Church's liberal and conservative wing. Critics of Pope Francis feel that the Vatican is systematically silencing, eliminating, and replacing critics of the Pope's views. Yes, he really is the Godfather.
Everybody's wondering today, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope?
Let me ask you about another area that you campaigned on quite a lot, and there was a flurry of activity on, and that has to do with immigration.
Sure.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops this week condemned some of the executive orders signed by President Trump, specifically those allowing immigration and customs enforcement to enter churches and to enter schools. Do you personally support the idea of conducting a raid or enforcement action in a church service, at a school?
Well, let me address this. Of course, if you have a person who is convicted of a violent crime, whether they're an illegal immigrant or a non-illegal immigrant, you have to go and get that person to protect the public safety. That's not unique to immigration. But let me just address this particular issue, Margaret, because as a practicing Catholic, I was actually heartbroken by that statement. And I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops needs to actually look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that when they receive over $100 million to help resettle illegal immigrants, are they worried about humanitarian concerns, or are they actually worried about their bottom line? We are going to enforce immigration law. We're going to protect the American people.
Yeah.
Donald Trump promised to do that. And I believe the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, if they're worried about the humanitarian costs of immigration enforcement, let them talk about the children who have been sex trafficked because of the wide open border of Joe Biden.
You personally
Let them talk
support them
about
going
people
into
like
schools
Laken
and
Riley
churches.
who were brutally murdered. I support us doing law enforcement against violent criminals, whether they're illegal immigrants or anybody else, in a way that keeps us safe. Let me ask this question, Margaret. Let's separate the immigration issue. If you had a violent murderer in a school, of course I want law enforcement to go and get that person out.
Of course.
So what's the point of the question?
You changed the regulation this week. That's the point of the question.
Exactly.
Giving the authority
Yes.
to go into churches and go
Exactly.
into schools.
We empowered law enforcement to enforce
But
the
that
law
also
everywhere
has
to
a
protect
knock-on
Americans.
effect, a chilling effect, arguably, to people to not send their kids to school.
I desperately hope it has a chilling
in the
effect on
churches,
illegal
you think
immigrants
the
coming
U.S.
into our country.
Conference of Catholic Bishops are actively hiding criminals?
I think the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has frankly not been a good partner in common sense immigration enforcement that the American people voted for. And I hope, again, as a devout Catholic, that they'll do better.
Everybody's wondering today, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope?
Hello. So good to see you. God bless you and have good morning. How are you? I'm yourself. Yeah, thank you. Happy Easter to you, Father. Wonderful. I know you've not been feeling great, but it's good to see you in better health.
Grazie. Grazie.
And thank you for seeing me. Pray for you every day. God bless you.
Io prego per lei ogni giorno. Che Dio la benedica. Grazie.
Happy Easter. So good to see you.
The US Vice President, J.D. Vance, has met Pope Francis in a quick and private meeting. Vance, a Catholic who has clashed with the pontiff over the Trump administration's immigration policies, had a longer meeting at the Vatican with the Pope's second-in-command, Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. The Vatican said they had a cordial exchange of opinions on immigration and other issues. The Vice President, who has been visiting Italy with his family this weekend, met senior Vatican officials for more formal talks. The Pope did not take part in those discussions. The Pope and Vatican officials have criticized several of the policies of President Donald Trump's administration. Francis has called the immigration crackdown a disgrace. Vance, who became Catholic in 2019, has cited medieval-era Catholic teaching to justify the policy. But the Pope rebutted the theological concept Vance used to defend the crackdown in an unusual open letter to the US Catholic bishops about the Trump administration in February, and called Trump's plan a major crisis for the United States.
I won't pretend to give guidance to the Cardinals on who they should select as the next pope. We've got plenty of issues to focus on in the United States. I'll just say a prayer for wisdom, because I obviously want them to pick the right person. I want them to pick somebody who will be good for the world's Catholics. But I'll let them make that decision. And obviously, they're entitled to do so.
Everybody's wondering today, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope? Right around a time when this should be a big thing for J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance claims to be religious. He gets to meet with the Pope, but only to try to mansplain Christianity to him. But let's catch up a little bit to how we got to this time with J.D. Vance and with the Pope. So you have this open letter to American bishops from the Pope. This is back in February. He said that deporting people who often come from difficult situations violates the, quote, dignity of many men and women and of entire families. He wrote that he had followed closely the major crisis taking place in the U.S. with the initiation of a program of mass deportations. And he said that any policy built on force, quote, begins badly and will end badly. Experts say that by writing an open letter, the Pope was also indirectly addressing members of the new American administration, many of whom are Catholic, specifically Vice President J.D. Vance. Francis appeared to give a riposte to Mr. Vance, who recently talked about the Ordo Amoris, a medieval Catholic theological concept that established a hierarchy of duties that prioritized immediate obligations to one's family or community over distant needs. This is a thing that J.D. Vance has cited. Anyway, the Pope responded to that saying, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. The true Ordo Amoris that must be promoted is love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. But what does he know? Look, he's not actually infallible, but that does really seem to fit with what Christianity, at least ideally, is supposed to be about. He did eventually end up getting his meeting with the Pope, and it was, unfortunately, tragically, one of the last experiences that the Pope actually had.
The Pope has signed a canon law that would create personal ordinariates, which would pave the way for Anglicans to become Catholics. The law would allow them to hold on to many of their own customs and traditions. The document is an apostolic constitution called Anglicorium Cetibus, which means groups of Anglicans.
I am very proud to be here, but also very nervous, very worried. I've been nervous all day, and the reason I've been nervous is quite simple, and that is that this motion matters to me. It matters to me greatly. It's not a joke, it's not a game, it's not just a debate. I genuinely believe that the Catholic Church is not, to put it at its mildest, a force for good in the world.
The recent election of Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio to the position of Pope Francis I was an unprecedented event the world has never before witnessed. It is the first time in history that a member of the Jesuit order has been elected to the highest position of the Roman Catholic Church. Widely regarded as a benevolent missionary order, known for its educational institutions, the Jesuit order, as the Society of Jesus is commonly known, has long played an incredibly influential, albeit secretive, role in the destinies of nations, organizations, and individuals. Rulers, presidents, scholars, and even Catholics themselves, who are aware of the evil perpetrated by this powerful, far-reaching order, have left on record grave warnings that all should heed. Some admit that their own diabolical organizations were modeled on Jesuit principles. A number of those who sought to warn did so at the cost of their lives. Ignatius Loyola, 1491 to 1556, founder of the Society of Jesus and its first superior general. Nor will it contribute a little to our advantage if with caution and secrecy we foment and heighten the animosities that arise among princes and great men, even to such a degree that they may weaken each other. But if there appear any likelihood of reconciliation, then as soon as possible let us endeavor to be the mediators, lest others prevent us. Finally, let all with such artfulness gain the ascendant over princes, noblemen, and the magistrates of every place, that they may be ready at our beck, even to sacrifice their nearest relations and most intimate friends, when we say it is for our interest and advantage.
Infamous for its involvement in political intrigue, financial corruption, and criminal activities during the latter half of the 20th century. The Lodge, which was originally created as part of the wider Masonic tradition, evolved into a shadowy power network that infiltrated Italian politics, business, and even media. The P2 Lodge was founded in 1877 as a part of the Italian Grand Orient Freemasonry. Masonic lodges, including P2, were common in Europe and known for gathering intellectuals, politicians, and businessmen. It served as a lodge primarily for aristocrats and politicians who wanted to maintain a low profile in their Masonic activities. In the 1960s, the P2 Lodge began its transformation into a more secretive and politically active organization under the leadership of Licio Gelli. Gelli, an enigmatic figure with ties to fascist regimes during World War II, took control of the lodge in 1966 and used it as a tool to further his personal ambitions and political agenda. Licio Gelli had a controversial past, including working as a liaison for Mussolini's regime, and later cultivating ties with right-wing governments across Europe and South America. His charisma and political connections allowed him to shape the lodge into a vehicle for covert operations. Under Gelli's leadership, P2's membership swelled, reaching over 900 influential members. These included senior politicians, military officers, intelligence officials, bankers, businessmen, and journalists. Gelli carefully selected individuals who could wield power and serve as part of a clandestine network capable of influencing public affairs from behind the scenes. Its members sought to maintain control over key state institutions, such as the military, law enforcement, and the media, to steer political decisions and protect their financial interests. P2 became notorious for its central role in a series of scandals that shook Italy throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Many of which had far-reaching international implications. One of the most infamous episodes linked to P2 was the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks. The bank's chairman, Roberto Calvi, known as God's banker due to his connections with the Vatican, was a prominent member of P2.
Now, I want to tell you something about Freemasonry. If you look here on this chart, the orders that are in black, they admit all faiths, Christians, Jews, Muslims, it doesn't matter. It's the ancient Arabic order, Nobles Mystic Shrine, Shriners International.
Is this true? Do you think that there are Freemasons operating inside the clergy and even inside the episcopate?
We can assume this. We have no proofs because, you know, the Freemasonry is so organized that you cannot have a juridical proof.
Right. It's a secret society.
They are so clever and so, in some way, crafty, even, that you can never have a demonstration. But there are bishops and cardinals and priests, when they open their mouth, they are speaking like a Freemason, with all the, even with some jargon of a Freemason, with defending the typical principles of Freemasonry. If he is Freemason or not Freemason, but he is doing and implementing the principles of Freemasons. And now recently, there came out a priest, a Monsignor, who is a member of a Vatican dicastery, publicly advocating and praising the Freemasonry. And so it is, to me, already quite outing himself.
I have a story today that is really a contrast between two different stories that illustrates the disconnect or the virtual schism in the church today. There are numerous factions in the Church of Christ, one being painted with broad strokes to be called traditional Catholicism, and the other are, of course, the modernists, though they never call themselves that. Their position is pretty simple. They've held power in the church since the late 1950s to varying degrees, have near absolute power now in the church, and wants to bring a church into being that, in their words, listens to the Spirit speaking through the world for guidance. Now contrast that with traditional Catholics who simply want the same faith as has always been taught and proclaimed by the church for millennia, and you get a striking contrast. And this contrast is evident in two stories. The first is a story from America Magazine, where our new favorite Jesuit, Father Jim McDermott, appears to be praising the possibility of Francis imploding the church. And on the other, we have Archbishop Vigano, who gives us in an interview an understanding of how we got to where we are now in the church in our time. So let's dive into this story, because there really is no moderate position left in the church anymore. Let's start with Father Jim McDermott. Writing for Clown Church Central magazine known as America Magazine, Father Jim provides us with this rather scintillating story. Headline: Is Pope Francis prepping for doomsday in the church? I hope so. If we were to limit ourselves to hypothesizing this correlation, it would be at the very least a sign of ingenuity and a lack of foresight. The Society of Jesus, which was among the most important orders of the church, was the target of the action of the devil that corrupted its charisma and progressively laid it astray long before Vatican II. And today it is the assault body, so to speak, with profoundly we see being demolished what remains of the Catholic Church. To replace it with an amorphous NGO that can serve as a, quote, container of the religion of humanity, loved by the stonecutters and by the Leviathan, in accordance with the ideological bases set by the Council. Like all Jesuits, Bergoglio is first a Jesuit and then a Catholic. For this reason, Jesuits continue to be prohibited from ascending the ranks of the hierarchy, which is why the Argentine had to ask the Pope for a dispensation to be consecrated Archbishop of Buenos Aires. That dispensation, had it not been granted, respecting the rule of St. Ignatius, would have prevented us from the disasters we have seen since 2013. It is clear that the Jesuits played a prominent role, not only in carrying out the conciliar revolution, but also in the maneuvers to bring one of their own to the throne of Peter. End quote. The hierarchical nature is on purpose. Clericalism and rigidity, if you want to call it that, are on purpose. To pretend otherwise is to reject the mission of the church in favor of a purely secular mission. But many priests and laity have done just that.
The world's smallest army, the Swiss Guard, with their multicolored uniforms and medieval weapons. An army with rituals from a bygone age, and traditional weapons forged by an Austrian family whose methods have not changed since the Middle Ages.
The hook is for pulling in, and the point for stabbing.
They are between 19 and 30 years old. Tourists visiting St. Peter's Square in Vatican City might find them quaint. What most don't realize is that these men are indeed soldiers, trained in close combat and protection.
Someone runs at the Pope with a knife. I'm not saying I'd be proud to kill that person, but I think it would be necessary for the good of the church.
And my goodness me, every single detail of damnation and original sin, and of any possibility of your complaining or asking to think for yourself. I said, let's think of this square mile. Just imagine in this square mile how many people were burned for reading the Bible in English. And one of the principal burners and torturers of those who tried to read the Bible in English here in London was Thomas More. You may know if you've read the novel Wolf Hall, won the Man Booker Prize just the other day. Now, that's a long time ago. It's not relevant, except that it was only last century that Thomas More was made a saint, and it was only in the year 2000 that the last pope, the Pole, he made Thomas More the patron saint of politicians. This is a man who put people on the rack for daring to own a Bible in English. He tortured them for owning a Bible in their own language. The idea that the Catholic Church exists to disseminate the word of the Lord is nonsense. It is the only owner of the truth for the billions that it likes to boast about, because those billions are uneducated and poor, as again it likes to boast about. But they are the ones it can tell and bully and domineer. And then we come to children. Well, it's all very well to say the world didn't know better. The world had no knowledge of how dangerous a crime child abuse was. I want to read you some of the words of Ratzinger, the current Pope. Staggers me to admit that he is the head of state of a country. Incidentally, Anne Widdecombe said, "We didn't have the power of a nation state." Yes, you do. You are a nation state. Yes, I wrote it down. You mentioned that. And it is no accident that the Cairo the UN Cairo Population Conference, when they were trying to do something about the world's population spinning out of control, Vatican City, as a nation state represented at that conference, made a joint statement with the Islamic countries of the world, notably the most extreme Islamic countries of the world, led by Saudi Arabia, and it began on behalf of the revealed religions of the world.
On Tuesday night, September 20th, Pope Francis led a ceremony in Assisi, Italy's main square, where he prayed with about 450 representatives of world religions. It was the fifth time a pope had done so, beginning with John Paul II in 1986, marking a change both in how Catholicism engages the world and in the role of the papacy as the leader of all world religions. The meeting in Assisi is the latest step in the papal geopolitical agenda. In 1986, Pope John Paul, seeking to elevate the papacy's power in global politics, initiated the Assisi Peace Movement. His catchphrase, "The Spirit of Assisi," became the new Vatican mantra. The spirit of Assisi is nothing less than a declaration that all religions are the same, that they only differ in their cultural expression of their religion. All religions are the expression of humanistic ideals. This is the spirit of the Antichrist.
Everybody's wondering today, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope? Probably not. I mean, we have no proof. Not that that stops anyone else when it comes to the news, but
Hello. So good to see you.